We're here to talk about prohibition and the effect that it had on the bourbon industry, particularly here in Kentucky. First thing you got to remember about prohibition. Prohibition could never have taken effect if they had not passed the income tax amendment. Because before the income tax amendment, the tax on whiskey paid anywhere from 50 to 70% of the federal budget. It's still paying a huge amount. I would hate to think of how much money Jim Beam writes a week to the government just on taxes. So, prohibition couldn't have happened if they hadn't passed the income tax. Prohibition does come along, and I have seen figures that they seem to average that when they shut down the distilling industry and the brewer industry, they shut down about 10% of the American economy. That's going to hurt. And it hurts even more when you consider that you've got farmers out there that are trying to raise crops and sell grain. And a lot of people talk about the Great Depression starting with the stock market crash. I say it started 2 years earlier when farmers were burning their crops in the field because it would cost them more to harvest it than they could get for it. Grain that could have been used to make whiskey or beer. But also when you got to consider when you're hurting the farmers, right down to that level. You're hurting the distilleries, of course. You're shutting down all those jobs. You're hurting the people that are tied to the distribution part, you know, the liquor store owners and the saloon owners and things along those lines. But there's a lot of things that you don't consider. How many bottle workers? You know, how many bottles does it take to support this distilling and beer industry? How many labels that were being printed? What about the railroads? All of a sudden they're losing 10% of their shipping. The prohibition had a huge effect on the national and Kentucky's economy in particular. And one of the most telling things, see, I work for the Philson Historical Society. I'm not part of the industry, even though I have a great love of the industry, being that I've been studying it now for 20 years. And a consumer. But one of the things when the Depression did hit, just got through doing papers at the Philson on Judge Robert Worth Bingham. I think you all might have heard of him. And one of the big issues that they were attacking Hoover on was that he did not have a balanced budget. I know it sounds familiar. But what really struck everybody really curious is that the amount of debt, the federal debt that they were looking at, was the same amount of tax money they would have collected in 1 year of legal whiskey sales. Now, whiskey sales were just as big as they just weren't being taxed. So there were a lot of people that were putting two and two together and saying, let's get rid of this amendment and let's start taxing it and let's balance the budget. I always like to talk about the 18th Amendment by reminding everybody of this. The 18th Amendment is the only amendment to the Constitution that took away a freedom instead of guaranteeing a freedom, and it's the only amendment to be repealed. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill.
Mike may not be a member of the industry, but he is a treasure, as is the Philson Club. And I wasn't about to do this without him. Now let's get specific. In our family, prohibition did indeed lead to a depression. One that came much earlier for the Kentucky distilling families as it did for the Commonwealth as a whole. It also led to the realization that these grand bourbon barons, of which my grandfather was one, weren't so good at making a living when you took whiskey making away from them. My grandfather entered into a number of business ventures, and they all failed, like starting a Franklin automobile dealership and opening the People's Bank of Bardstown, on October 10th, 1929. Morton, you've seen the building out there. The reminder is still there. Now, sometime back, I asked my father, how come family friend, next door neighbor, and distinguished bourbon baron, Jim Beam, knew so much about all of our business disasters. Now, I used to spend, when I was a little kid, one of my jobs was walk next door and spend the afternoon listening to Colonel Beam. He spent most of the time telling me how incompetent my ancestors were. Well, I got enlightened when I asked my father that, and Dad said, well, the old bastard was a partner in all those business failures. And that's the way it was. Today, things are very different. Bourbon has emerged as the new cool adult beverage among moneyed young professionals, and not just in North America, but in Europe and Asia as well. Now, let me share with you some of the specifics. Number one, we currently have a monopoly in this fast growth category. 95% of the world's bourbon is made in Kentucky, but almost more importantly, 100% of the brands driving that growth come from Kentucky. Consumers have decided that Kentucky bourbon is one word. And I'm telling you, from a marketing perspective, that's a very good thing. Bourbon seems to be portable. This is one of the things you never know until you start to try to go beyond the neighborhood. It travels well. There's a lot of spirits categories that don't travel well, like Canadian whiskey and California wine have had a terrible time reaching beyond their base. And we're just starting to feel the impact of the internationalization of this very local Kentucky product. And I think it's going to be huge. Number three, economic analysts are saying bourbon is a global trend and not a short-term fad. They've got a lot of data to support that. We've been at it long enough to where it's those of us that make an invest are very comfortable with that analysis because we're all investing like crazy. And you know, when we invest, it takes many years to get a return on that investment. Number four, with rapid sustainable growth come jobs. And in our industry, the jobs multiplier, the economic multiplier, Mike mentioned some of them. We are, out of 160 categories, bourbon industry is third in economic multiplier. All the barrels are made here, the grains here, the labels, blah, blah, blah. And it is huge because it spreads the impact of what we do beyond the 6 counties that make the whiskey. Okay? Number five, premium bourbon is the ultimate value-added business. When a farmer takes a bushel of corn to market, he might get 6.5. When that same bushel of corn goes to market as Maker's Mark, it brings in almost $600. Now that's high margins, and high margins lead to high-paying jobs. And fortunately, all the distilleries participating in this revival, the brands that are doing really well are the high-margin brands. That's very good for the state. Number six, as bourbon has reemerged, the owning companies, the companies that own the distilleries, have started moving bottling of non-bourbon products back to Kentucky. Probably none of y'all, unless you're involved in the industry, have ever heard of this. 11% of the U.S. distilled spirits market is bourbon. 40% of all of the stuff on the shelves in the liquor stores is bottled here in Kentucky, and that percentage continues to grow every year. That's jobs, and it's really high-paying jobs. Number seven, in fact, the bourbon industry has been the only manufacturing sector in the Commonwealth to grow jobs during these last 4 years of what I thought was a depression until we run into the election and it was called a recovery. But it wasn't all that great. Jobs in our little industry grew 50%. How's that? During that same last year, our little industry had capital investments of over $270 million with more planned next year. I mean, we went 20 years where we didn't spend 20 cents between us all. Number 8, with Kentucky bourbon's new popularity, we have the emergence of the Midwest's fastest growing tourist attraction, the Bourbon Trail. Now, this year, nearly 600,000 distillery visits by people who are primarily from out of state, but more importantly, they're not coming in campers. They're coming in BMWs and Jaguars, and they're spending a hell of a lot of money in Kentucky. So don't run them off the road. Number 9, and this Mike kind of touched on this one, and I couldn't agree with him more. There's this funny little joke that's been going around Kentucky for about 170 years, and some of us don't think it's too damn funny. And that is, to be designated a signature industry in Kentucky is not necessarily a good thing. Number 1, coal is being beat to death by the Democrats. Rural Republicans here in Kentucky are doing all they can to ensure our signature thoroughbred industry fails. And until Governor Beshear stepped in to the fray during these last 4 years, and I'll admit I'm a Republican, he's done a hell of a job. Until he stepped in and said, we're going to support this industry, the Baptists had us labeled a sin industry. And anybody that's done any marketing know that if you're trying to sell something, being a sin industry is not a good thing. All in all, things could hardly be better for the Bourbon Boys. In fact, I see only one dark cloud on the horizon, but unfortunately, it could be a big one. The micro distillery startup. You know, when something succeeds, everybody wants to play. I mean, we went 50 years after Dad started Makers, nobody started up. In the last 4 years, we've had 350 micro distilleries start up. Every one of them aspires to be the next Makers or Woodford, right? That's a good thing. The bad thing is that only 6 of them have started up in Kentucky. Okay? Now, what do you think that means for our monopoly in the next 20 years? It means we probably won't have it. Now, I've talked to a lot of these folks. They call, and one of the great things about the folks in our industry, not only that we get along and we really do like each other, but we help the startups. And so they call asking for advice. And we ask them, how come not Kentucky? They say, in general, the answer is business climate. Specifically, the answer is that damn ad valorem tax. The ad valorem tax was a product of the industry not supporting Happy Chandler when he ran for governor the first time. And he got Franklin Circuit Court to rule that bourbon was a finished product when it came out of the still, even though you can't call it bourbon and no fool would drink it right after it come out of the still. But that started the ad valorem clock. So every year rolls around, the ad valorem tax on that barreled bourbon, you pay it. In our case, we pay it 6 times. It's the only product in the only state that ad valorem tax is paid more than once. And that is what's keeping that's the main reason that's keeping these startups from moving into the state that would welcome them and would love to have them. And for all of our grandchildren, it would be a shame to have this signature industry get away from us. Now, that's it. I'm not whining anymore. It's still a hell of a lot better than it was during the period when Mike's talking about, because that was terrible. So I really want to close. I want to thank y'all for allowing us to come in and talk a little bit about this very special industry. And isn't it nice to know that at least one of Kentucky's signature industries is healthy, and that it doesn't require any government stimulus, surplus, or bailout. Thank y'all very much.